Ονομάζομαι Ραφαηλή Γεωργία Στιουκή. Είμαι 29 ετών, μένω στην Κοζάνη και είμαι από την Κοζάνη. Αυτή τη στιγμή εργάζομαι ως αναπληρώτρια καθηγήτρια αγγλικών σε νηπιαγωγεία. Δυστυχώς η ζωή στην Κοζάνη έχει αλλάξει δραματικά τα τελευταία χρόνια, ειδικότερα αφού ανακοινώθηκε το κλείσιμο των λιγνητικών μονάδων. Αρκετοί νέοι άνθρωποι έχουν φύγει από την περιοχή, είτε σε μεγάλα αστικά κέντρα, είτε στο εξωτερικό, και οι περισσότεροι είναι στο εξωτερικό, κυρίως φίλοι μου. Πρώτα απ' όλα θεωρώ ότι έχω ενημερωθεί σωστά και η δεξιότητα που έχω ανακαλύψει σε όλο αυτό είναι το public speaking, γιατί είμαι σε θέση πλέον να μιλάω και σε άλλους συνανθρώπους μου, είτε νέους είτε μεγαλύτερης ηλικιακής ομάδας, και έχω καταφέρει αυτή τη στιγμή να έχω την κατάλληλη ενημέρωση, την κατάλληλη γνώση για πράγματα που δεν είναι στο πεδίο των σπουδών μου και που ούτε είχα ασχοληθεί και ποτέ, να είμαι ειλικρινής.
Η Μακεδονία βρίσκεται σε μια περίοδο όπου τα εργοστάσια της ΔΕΗ, τα ρυπογόνα εργοστάσια, σταματάνε τη λειτουργία τους, αλλά πρέπει να βρούμε νέες λύσεις. Μία από αυτές τις λύσεις, η πράσινη, η υποφελής για το περιβάλλον, είναι και οι ανανεώσιμες πηγές ενέργειας. Και οι πόροι ΣΕΔΕ αποτελούν ένα κομμάτι το οποίο, κατά τη δική μας άποψη, πρέπει να διοχετευτεί ειδικά στις περιοχές οι οποίες αντιμετωπίζουν τις προκλήσεις της μετάβασης. Αυτοί οι πόροι ανήκουν κατά τη μία έννοια σε αυτές τις περιοχές οι οποίες για περισσότερα από 80 χρόνια αποτέλεσαν και συνεχίζουν να αποτελούν με τα έργα στις ανανεώσιμες πηγές ενέργειας την ενεργειακή καρδιά της χώρας μας, αλλά και μία από τις βασικότερες ενεργειακές καρδιές της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης.
Ο χώρος ενδείκνυται για δραστηριότητες σεμιναριακές, εκπαιδευτικές, διαδραστικές, αθλητικές δραστηριότητες, με έναν χώρο ξέχωρο συνεδριακό, με έναν χώρο συνεργατικό, το λεγόμενο co-working space, που θα λειτουργήσει στο μέλλον και ως θερμοκοιτίδα καινοτόμων ιδεών και πιθανότατα και επιχειρήσεων, και έναν χώρο εστίασης και διαμονής, όπου είναι το λεγόμενο youth hostel. Καθώς βασικός σκοπός μας δεν είναι μόνο να δημιουργηθεί ένα κέντρο απλά για να έχει τοπικό αντίκτυπο, είναι ένα κέντρο το οποίο θέλουμε να είναι διεθνούς εμβέλειας, ένα κέντρο το οποίο μπορεί να φιλοξενεί και δραστηριότητες φιλοξενώντας κόσμο από άλλες χώρες, για να έχουμε αυτή τη διαπολιτισμική διάσταση συνεχώς. Γιατί μιλάμε για ανάπτυξη νέων δεξιοτήτων, για νέα επαγγέλματα. Φεύγει το παραδοσιακό μοντέλο που λειτουργούσε τα τελευταία 30 τουλάχιστον χρόνια στη Δυτική Μακεδονία, της μονοκαλλιέργειας και της παραγωγής ενέργειας μέσω του λιγνίτη, το οποίο απορροφούσε αρκετές θέσεις εργασίας, και πλέον μιλάμε για ένα νέο μοντέλο το οποίο πρέπει να βασιστεί στην καινοτομία, πρέπει να έχει χαρακτηριστικά σύγχρονης αγοράς εργασίας και σε καμιά περίπτωση δεν μπορεί να αφήσει την νεολαία έξω.
Στόχος δηλαδή αυτού του Εθνικού Ταμείου Δίκαιης Μετάβασης είναι να χρηματοδοτήσει δράσεις για το μετασχηματισμό των τοπικών κοινωνιών και οικονομιών στις λιγνητικές περιοχές της χώρας. Από το 2018 στο 2023, στο Εθνικό Ταμείο Δίκαιης Μετάβασης, σε αυτούς τους πόρους, έχει συγκεντρωθεί ένα ποσό της τάξης των 127-128 εκατομμυρίων ευρώ. Μέχρι σήμερα, οι πόροι που έχουν διοχετευτεί από το Εθνικό Ταμείο Δίκαιης Μετάβασης, πρέπει να πούμε ότι χαρακτηρίζονται από μεγάλες καθυστερήσεις, τόσο στην διοχέτευση των πόρων, όσο και στην απορρόφησή τους. Επίσης, παρατηρούμε ότι δίνονται σε διαφορετικές δράσεις, θα έλεγα μάλλον διάσπαρτες, όχι μέσα στο πλαίσιο ενός συνεκτικού σχεδιασμού για το μετασχηματισμό των λιγνητικών περιοχών και ως πραγματικό συμπλήρωμα στους πόρους του Ευρωπαϊκού Ταμείου Δίκαιης Μετάβασης. Έτσι βλέπουμε ότι αρκετές από τις ανάγκες των περιοχών, όπως είναι η συγκράτηση της φυγής των νέων, δεν καλύπτονται αρκετά, ακόμα και αν βλέπουμε κάποιες δράσεις για την νεολαία.
A lot of progress has been made recently, especially in the power sector. Greenhouse gas emissions have been going down thanks to the European emissions trading system working hand in hand with binding renewable energy targets. A lot of progress still needs to be made, especially to phase out the use of coal and lignite in the power sector as soon as possible. And this must go hand in hand with a just transition for the workers. ETS auctioning revenues can and should be used to fund such measures to ensure a fair and a just transition for all.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the fifth one under the Carbon Pricing Hub series, a space for citizens and civil society to be involved with the EU's emissions trading system as one of the key policy instruments to achieve our climate objectives. This event is organized by Carbon Market Watch together with WISE Netherlands under the framework of the Life ETX emissions trading extra project, a project financed and supported by the LIFE program of the European Union. My name is Anna Gumbau. I'm a climate and energy journalist, and I'm very excited to be able to moderate and to host this discussion that we are having today on how to make the EU's carbon pricing and its revenues work for the many, work for the citizens and for the climate. What you have just seen in this little video is a video from the Human Stories project, the project that we will be hearing more about in a few minutes, where the partners of this project traveled to different European locations to try to understand how the revenues from carbon pricing from the EU emissions trading system are making a positive impact in communities across the continent. As said, we'll be hearing more about it later. So what's on today's menu, what we can expect is, first of all, we'll be hearing the results of a report that was made in the framework of this project called Emissions Aristocracy, in which we'll be hearing about the usage of revenues, and especially on the most polluting companies under the EU's emissions trading system. Then we will have a second video on the Human Stories project. We'll be traveling all the way to Portugal to see how ETS revenues are also making an impact over there. That we'll be hearing more about the project in and of itself and everything that happened behind the scenes and what were the main learnings of this project. And then we will be finishing with a panel discussion on which we'll be tying up these things together, how to make the ETS work for citizens and for the climate, and how can a strong policy framework incentivize that. So, without further ado, let's get with today's program started. I already have with me Lidia Tamellini. She's an EU expert on industrial decarbonization at Carbon Market Watch, who will be presenting the outcomes of this report, of the Emissions Aristocracy report, which highlighted the 30 most polluting companies under the EU ETS, and which will also have a little game, a little poll for you. So, Lidia, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Anna, for the presentation. Indeed, what I wanted to do today is really give some context to the main topic being how we use ETS revenues in a way that's meaningful and impactful for citizens and communities. When we talk about revenues, we need to take a step back. So when we discuss revenues, we need to understand, as you very well know, that we have revenues because some companies pay for the carbon pollution they produce. And with my presentation today, we want to understand who's paying, how much, who is not paying, and maybe should be paying. So I'm presenting a piece of work that we published just a few weeks back at the end of November that we call the Emissions Aristocracy. And it says here, it's an investigation on the top 30 EU ETS polluters, which is true, but it wasn't meant to be at first. It really started with us noticing there was a gap in the available data, in the publicly available data. So on public databases, namely on the EU transaction log provided by European Commission, we are able, of course, to see the yearly verified emissions, the free allowances. We're even able to disaggregate data by sectors. Through other databases, we are also able to access those data by installation. But we weren't able to give a name to those who are responsible for that carbon pollution. And this is why we started this investigation, which really started as a big database provided by our researcher to us. And really reading through this database, some findings really stood out immediately. It was immediately clear and apparent that in this huge list of thousands and thousands of companies, the very top of the pyramid, the very top of the list, made up of 30 companies, was responsible for half, a bit over half, the total EU ETS emissions for the year. The year taken in consideration is 2022. So for 2022, you can see here the total verified emission were 1.36 billion tons of CO2, and more than 566 million of free allowances that were handed out. In both cases, just at the very top of the pyramid was occurring the free allowances emitting the most CO2, which was impressive. You can see here, just as a visual form of visual aid, you can see in the bottom images, so the blue is the amount of the companies in top 30 over the total amount of companies, was over 3,000, and then the amount of emissions they produced. And that's the list, the blue bars, of the top 30. I need to point something out. Several companies are represented. You can see the power sectors is well represented among other sectors, but this is a distinction we need to make immediately. Who are these companies very much linked to what they do? Of course, you can see the list of the sectors that are represented in the top 30. We see power sector, we see steel, cement, and finally oil refinement and petrochemicals. There is, though, a distinction to be made. The power sector is very well represented among the top polluters, but you'll see very shortly in the next slides that it follows a very different decarbonization trajectories. And one of the reasons why we think that is that the power sector is fully exposed to the carbon price since 2013. They are not receiving any free allowances under the EU ETS. And that's not really the case for the other companies. So you can see here the decarbonization trajectory is quite different. So the top line, the blue line, represents the power sector, so combustion and fuels, and the bottom line, the pink line, represents industrial installations. So it's very different. This graph starts showing the trajectory from 2010 up until 2022. You can see, I will consider now the data until 2020. You can see the decarbonization trajectory of the power sector is quite steep, whereas in the same time frame, we can really say that heavy industry has decarbonized significantly. The percentage is really negligible. What happened in 2020? You can see there is a variation that we can observe. In 2020, as we all know, the COVID-19 crisis struck. And right after, the energy crisis struck, mostly due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So with the COVID-19 crisis and then the energy crisis, industrial installation gradually decreased their production over time. And at the same time, utility companies were resorting to most polluting but cheaper form of fossil fuels. So this has this contributed to the change in the decarbonization trajectory, which though doesn't really change the whole story. And we expect this trajectory to really go back to what it was before 2020 shortly. As soon as we'll have the data from 2023, we will be able maybe to update this report and show what is happening right now. So again, why did this? Why the trajectory so diverging? We have a main suspect. I maybe will pose a question to the audience before I go to the next slide, and I would like to ask, how much value in free allowances do you think we will be ending out in phase 4 of the EU ETS, which is between 2021 and 2030? Maybe I'll give a few seconds to answer. And then we will be able to see, yes, the question. So we have a few options here, just to give you an idea of the order of magnitude of the allowances that we're talking about. Okay, I see there's a few, there's some issues, but it's all right. We can maybe give the audience an opportunity to reply, and then we go further with the presentation. And of course, you can find the answer if you are able to read the report. And the answer is here. So thanks to the free allowances system, we will be ending out in the span of 9 years of free allowances for around 400 billion euros. This is at the current ETS price, which is between 84 euros per ton, which is impressive and doesn't take into account all the free allowances that we already handed out over the years, which I'll show you shortly is a very, very significant amount. So what are free emissions allowances? Of course, auctioning is the default system for handing out allowances under the EU ETS. But some sectors are deemed at least of carbon leakage, which means they're deemed at risk of relocating their production outside of Europe if they're forced to pay for the carbon price. And due to this unproven risk, they have been able to avoid paying for their carbon pollution over decades at this point. And still, again, I repeat that auctioning should be the default method, but even now, for heavier industries that at risk or deemed at risk of carbon leakage, free allowances covers around 90 to 95% of the CO2 emissions. Here you can see from this graph, from the inception of the EU ETS from 2005. So in the first years of the EU ETS, free allowances were severely over-allocated. Then over time, you can see there's a steep decrease due to the power sector not be allowed free allowances anymore in 2013. And still now, you can see from the very last year that we consider 2022, almost half of the total ETS emissions are not paid for, basically. And this value can be accounted, the value that was handed out just this year can be accounted for with 55 billion of euros, which is an impressive amount. And I do have another question before I move on to analyzing the specific sectors that we want to deal with today. And I will consider 3 sectors, and which do you think accrued the most free allowances in this year, the year we consider 2022. So the options are steel, cement, or petrochemical sector. And maybe in a few seconds we'll be able to see the answers. Lizanne? Okay. Okay, I see the audience is very well versed into the topic. I've been told from the room, which is great. Perfect. Fantastic. Indeed, indeed, if we can move back to the presentation, the answer is the steel sector. At the moment, well, one of the most polluting sectors in Europe, and definitely the one who has accrued the most free allowances overall, with company ArcelorMittal leading group, just accruing in 2022 3.7 billion in free allowances. All companies under these sectors have some sort of climate pledges. Normally, they pledge to be carbon neutral by 2050, but even the International Energy Agency has declare the sector not on track for net zero by 2050. So of course, some further efforts are needed. Some of of the suggestions that we make, of the recommendations we make for the sector, especially considering participating in the EU ETS, is of course, apart from phasing out as fast as possible the free allowances system, but to improve the product benchmarking to make sure that production that's circular and greener is encouraged. And we also need to make sure that there's a strong focus on electrification of the sector and on energy efficiency for the sectors, as it's very energy intensive. Secondly, cement sector, a very inherently polluting sector, also highly energy intensive, but most of the pollution coming from cement production really stems from clinker, from the production of clinker, from the chemical process that allows us to obtain clinker. So even in this case, industries have shown climate pledges, in most cases very vague, with one notable exception for Holcim. Similar recommendation from our side, the product benchmarking needs to be improved. And in this case, what needs to be encouraged is innovative cement production that does not require clinker or require a lesser amount of clinker. This will really help decarbonize the sector fast. Finally, petrochemicals, another very inherently polluting sectors due to their need for fossil fuel input, due to the chemical reactions that need to take place, and also due to some degree of reluctancy from the industry to rapidly transition when no regulatory requirements are in place. In this case, our most urgent recommendations are including all petrochemicals under the upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism. And also, we want to ensure that inclusion of permanent carbon capture and utilization under the EU ETS will follow very strict criteria to make sure there's no leakage in this sense. So what are some key takeaways? As I already explained, the very diverging decarbonization trajectories, and the fact the free allowances with a growing carbon price have become a significant financial asset. And as the carbon price grows, we need to make sure that companies are exposed fully to the carbon price in order for them to receive the right investment signals and in order for them to correctly invest in carbon-free technologies. We have a few general recommendations in our report to how to make polluters pay. I really warmly suggest you read the full report. There's a lot more data that I was unable, of course, to explain today. I will focus on the last of our recommendation that really well links to the videos and the presentation. And this is to support effective climate policies and zero carbon technologies through the auctioning revenues. And this is what my colleague Noemi will be able to maybe dwell a bit into in the next presentation.
Excellent, Lydia. So
Thank
you
so
very
much.
much for this first presentation on a very exhaustive report and investigation in such a short period of time. I think there's a lot of data to take in, but our audience will be short. I'm sure that they'll be able to and interested in reading the report in detail. So thank you very much for being with us in today's event and for presenting the results, also for this little gamification and pop quiz. And now we are moving to the next section of the event where we'll be talking in a bit more detail on the Human Stories project. But first, let's see one of the videos of the outcome of this project. This time we are traveling to Portugal.
Olá, o meu nome é Laura, eu vivo no Montijo há cerca de 2 meses, mas vivi durante mais de 2 décadas em Lisboa e foi em Lisboa que eu comecei a usar a bicicleta como meio de transporte habitual. Em relação ao fundo ambiental, ainda não obtive o apoio, mas estou a pensar fazê-lo daqui a 1 ou 2 meses.
Olá, o meu nome é Catarina e vivo em Lisboa. Em 2018, devido ao aumento do número de ciclovias, comecei novamente a usar a bicicleta de forma diária e regular, para ir para todo o lado. Trabalho, cinema, compras, ir ter com amigos. Este ano candidatei-me ao Fundo Ambiental e recebi 85 euros.
MUBI é uma associação sem fins lucrativos que nasceu em 2009 com o objetivo inicial de criar condições melhores para quem se desloca e quem usa a bicicleta no seu dia-a-dia. E tem feito esse trabalho ao longo dos anos, tentando influenciar a nível nacional políticas públicas a nível de orçamento de Estado e também a nível local, através das suas secções locais, junto das câmaras municipais e das autarquias em geral. O MUBI irá continuar este trabalho de tentar, no fundo, conseguir cada vez mais dinheiro para apoiar pessoas que querem deslocar-se de outra forma que não o carro, como bicicleta de carga para levar os filhos à escola.
As receitas do CEL são canalizadas para projetos na área dos transportes públicos, incluindo aqueles que pretendem melhorar a rede de metro, as infraestruturas de redes de metro e também o programa de apoio à redução das tarifas dos transportes públicos. Procura-se assim incentivar as pessoas a utilizar um meio de transporte que é mais ativo, mais suave e reduzir a dependência dos combustíveis fósseis.
Gostaríamos, por isso, de ter mais informação detalhada sobre quais os projetos que as receitas provenientes do CEL estão realmente a apoiar, porque isso ainda não está bem claro. Isto será particularmente importante no futuro, porque a nova diretiva do CEL da União Europeia exige que todas as receitas sejam gastas em ações climáticas.
The example from Portugal shows how the emissions trading system, which puts a price on carbon pollution, actually can also serve to invest in solutions. We see good examples here of clean public transport, of nature conservation projects which are funded by the revenues coming from pollution pricing. More of this is needed throughout Europe. Still too many emission allowances are handed out for free to large industries. If we auction those, it creates more revenues to invest in climate-friendly solutions.
Videos on the Human Stories project from Greece and from Portugal on how EU ETS revenues are making a positive impact in communities across Europe. But what is the story behind this project? And next to me is one of the persons that has been very much involved in this project. I'm talking about the communications lead at the Life ETX project, Noemi Rodrigo Sabio. Welcome with us, Noemi. Great that you will tell us some stories behind the scenes from this project. How would you summarize what the Human Stories project is in just a few sentences?
Yeah, so the Life ETX Human Stories project is basically a compilation of 4 different stories from 3 different countries, which aim was since the beginning to materialize how the EU emissions trading system, such a complex and technical topic like we have seen, materialize at national level and through human stories. So that's how we started working with partners from the consortium, because it's of course a project carried out by the Life ETX consortium, and we work together with Green Tank, with MUBI, with Zero in Portugal, and with BBL in Belgium, in defining these stories and talking at the end about green mobility in Portugal, about the links between youth unemployment and youth hope in Greece, together with decarbonization, and the concrete case of the port of Ghent in Belgium.
You spoke to a lot of people as a result of this project. What did the people and the communities you visit talk to you and tell you about carbon pricing? How did they perceive that in practice?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question, because it deals with the first premise that we had when we started working in this project, and is the idea that there was a huge gap between what the EU emissions trading system is and this national and local context. So what we found out is that most of the protagonists of all the stories did not know about the emissions trading system. Of course, once they make these links between what it is and how it impacts their lives, they quickly make the click and realize how important and how it was benefiting and impacting their lives. So I will say, yeah, that was the main aspect, and it was very interesting in the project to building these bridges. So it was a very nice experience.
Really interesting. What were perhaps the main learnings and the main conclusions or outcomes of the project?
Yeah, I will say the first one will be that the EU emissions trading system, again, something so abstract, has and translates in many multiple phases and stories. So that diversity, it's something that it was very interesting to see, and that's something that we can see in the 4 different stories. It moves from a port in Belgium to birds that are trying to fly again in Portugal, to more concrete stories of youth people in Greece. So that was very interesting, and on the other hand, also the fact that these stories reinforce our message, the message of the project and the message of the consortium that we had since the beginning of the project. That idea, and that has been almost like a mantra since the beginning of the project, the idea that the EU emissions trading system is an effective climate tool, but it needs to be implemented properly. We have seen a lot of good cases on how this can be done, but more needs to be done. Polluters need to pay for their pollution, and the revenues out of it need to be properly and wisely spent on climate solutions, attending the necessities of our society.
Definitely, because we're seeing this positive impact in clean transport to biodiversity, but also to innovation for those companies that are even a part of the EU emissions trading system. Because then, what are perhaps some challenges maybe that you found on the way when?
I will say one of the main challenges was to define these stories, actually, because of course we were starting from a macro perspective, which is the mechanism as such, and to find out these very concrete and local stories coming from such a broad angle, it was challenging. It was almost a bit like trying to pick up a drop from the ocean. So we were a little bit at the beginning, a little bit in that stage, and that's where the collaboration with the local organizations, which we did not intend it at the beginning to include, but we realized that were a key piece of the chain. So together with national partners, this organization helped us to identify these stories, but also to contact and to reach with people who would like to share their stories, and we could give them voice. So that was probably
I get the feeling that now that you were mentioning such a close cooperation with partners from across Europe and local organizations must have actually been also quite fun. What did the project mean to you then, also at a personal level?
I will say, first of all, it was an amazing experience to work with those colleagues, our partners working at national level, kilometers away from Brussels, so at personal level, to get to know better them and to get to know in the field together with them, taking decisions together in the spot, and understanding better our work in that way. But definitely, I will say that the biggest is to put a face on that we are working every day here, and that becomes and it looks like so abstract, and also in a way to be part of this project allowed me to have a better understanding on how relevant is the EU ETS in our society. to be in the spot, knowing these people in the field, allowed me to realize that beauty of it, and that's the beauty that I hope that these videos share with everyone watching them. And yes, as you know, they are part of the Life ETX website. They will be also in the Carbon Market Watch YouTube channel, as well on our partners' website.
Okay, that was meant to be my last question, actually. Like, where can people follow these human stories? Where can they get to know more about the project? So there's a dedicated website of its own.
Exactly. So there is the Life ETX website, which is etxtra.org, and part of that there will be also in Carbon Market Watch YouTube channels and on the consortium, the partners involved websites as well.
Excellent. Well, I think it's great to get to know this project, and I think it makes a very important point on the positive impact that ETS revenues have on societies and on cities and for people and biodiversity. So I think it's great to be able to put a face to those who benefit also from those revenues. So thank you very much, Noemi, for being with us and introducing this project. And you've heard where you can continue following and know more about the Life ETX Human Stories project. So thanks a lot for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
All right, and now we are moving to the last part of our program today, which is a panel discussion in which we'll be putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. We started by talking about ETS revenues, how they are spent, who is paying, who is not paying, what can be done about that. And we've also seen some of the benefits in practice that that the usage of ETS revenues can bring to our societies and to local communities, as well as in terms of innovation. So the question is now is to put everything together, to also discuss what's the policy framework behind it, how can it be strengthened. So I would like to invite my panelists to join me on this online stage, and we'll be able to get started. Excellent. So we have a really great lineup of speakers joining us here in person in our studio, but also virtually. One of the speakers is finishing to get prepared and will be joining us shortly. But then, since I already have her with me, I would like to then maybe start by welcoming our first one of the speakers, Sarah Nasraoui. You are the UN Youth Representative for Sustainable Development, representing the Netherlands in this process. And I think it would be great to hear from you how what we've been discussing so far resonates with you in terms of the importance of the EU emissions trading system and its impact and positive impact in its societies. Was there something that struck you in particular about that?
I think on initial thoughts, especially representing youth, the first thing that struck me is that the EU ETS seems very complicated and seems super technical, but it was nice to gather this more personal perspective on it as well to make it more accessible, more understandable, as what it does is more than just an economic function. But I'm really excited to discuss further because although it gave me a lot of answers to learn a little bit more about the EU ETS, it left me with more questions as well.
Definitely. One of the key questions that we intend to answer is really how can we make carbon pricing for the many, and like which narrative can we build around carbon pricing? And we have one of the members of the European Parliament that has been most involved in this past legislation on reinforcing and strengthening our carbon pricing policies. I'm talking about S&D member of the European Parliament, Mohamed Shahim. Mr. Shahim, perhaps a question going back a little bit to the basics and not going so depth on the policies yet, but when you go back to your constituents and talk about the work that you do, how easy or how difficult it is to communicate about carbon pricing, about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, how hard it is for you to do that?
I mean, it depends on how you want to explain things. I mean, every policy needs to be explained, I think, to everyone and can be explained to everyone. It depends on the narrative and it depends on what you're trying to explain. If you want to explain how ETS works, it's complicated even to explain it to a professor or to anyone who's knowledge. I mean, it's a very complicated matter, and I'm very happy that, you know, every politician usually has many very good assistants that have helped me understand the substance, but also a lot of experts here in Brussels and outside Brussels. Researchers, experts, activists that know what the problem is with the system and how you can improve it. For me, when I talk about ETS, it's about, you know, mechanisms that could help change the system, because it's a very powerful tool, but collective problems need collective solutions. And what you see with a system approach, a policy that really looks at the big polluters, I think the starting point is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of issues within the system. Free allowances is one of them. We can go there. But what it does, it forces producers to rethink about, let's say, their inefficiency, their emissions that maybe are not even necessary. That's the first step. Then we can talk about cleaning up the system and decarbonizing it full stop. But the idea of narrowing down and making sure that polluters pay, I think many people will understand that principle. And for that also, we don't make consumers responsible, but producers. I think that's also an interesting starting point. And as I say, when it comes to climate change and energy transition, there's never one size fits all. It's one strong instrument, and we need other instruments to tackle other issues to, at the end, become climate neutral by, let's say, halfway this century.
Definitely. Yeah. Carbon pricing is one piece of the puzzle, but it's a really important one. And you've mentioned something that is very important on how this has led companies to rethink their own processes. And this brings me to our next speaker joining us online, who is actually at the forefront and leading the decarbonization of a power company, of a clean power company. And we've been seeing in Lydia's presentation how the trajectory of power companies in the decarbonization has been quite different, also because of their full exposure to the EU emissions trading system. So I would like to discuss that with the head of low carbon and European energy policies at Enel, Daniele Agostini. What did the presentation and what we've been discussing here at today's event so far resonate with Enel's own decarbonization journey as one of these, front runners in the decarbonization of the power sector?
I think, can you hear me? Can you confirm you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. No, it resonated quite a bit on a number of fronts. First of all, I think just as you said in the previous question, helping bring this a bit of an exoteric instrument, policy instrument, to a wider audience by emphasizing some of its advantages. The one of generating revenues and the importance of using these revenues to help our systems decarbonize. And I think a lot has been done. I think the power sector you were referring to, and again, as in we're a big utility with unfortunately sort of historical past in the fossil fuel part with coal and gas, but we're strongly committed. We're phasing out our coal in Europe by 2025 and globally by 2027. So although we are part in your report mentioned as one of the emitters, we're working very hard, and the revenues of the ETS have helped us decarbonize the systems, have helped us build renewables, build the smart grids to connect those renewables, and we're also looking at carbon credits helping us bring a just transition of phasing out our coal plants. And that's not so much in terms of our own operations, which we are going to be phasing out just because the incentive is there. And part of that incentive, of course, is what you mentioned earlier in your introduction, the fact that we need to pay for our allowances. But we're looking for incentives from the Just Transition Fund to help the surrounding communities and the value chain decarbonize. So again, we see the revenues of the ETS have played a very important role. And unfortunately, that role has not been as significant as probably it should have been in the industrial sector. So at the moment, we're very much engaged in trying to make sure that that those industrial companies that are really seriously engaged in decarbonization can take advantages of some of the incentives provided by the auction of ETS allowances to help them integrate new technologies into their decarbonization. We're doing it ourselves as well. We're trying to introduce green hydrogen in some of our industrial clients, and it's working well. So there are companies out there that are in the industrial realm that are working hard, and we have to make sure that they're awarded and with the right incentives in terms of paying for the allocation of allowances, and also getting good incentives for introducing pioneering technologies.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned something very important and mentioned it a few times, which is the question of incentives. And maybe because of that, I would like to then come back to Lydia, because you just painted the picture before on how things currently stand with existing EU ETS and as we have just begun phase 4, but now with the revision of the EU ETS and Fit for 55 package and the way that the new legislation is in place at the moment with tighter targets, etc. Do you think it's providing more incentives to also, let's say, especially heavy industry to be decarbonizing? How would you assess that?
Well, great question, and the question, right? Are we giving enough incentives, or are we putting enough pressure on the industry to decarbonize? Of course, after the Fit for 55 package was issued, a lot changed, right? You can even see into when you check the carbon price over time after the Fit for 55 package was issued. There were some changes, there were some fluctuations that were interesting to notice. Of course, policy is an investment signal, one of the most important, of course, investment signals there are. So indeed, that helped a lot. At the same time, I need to go back again to the power versus heavy industries distinction. We've seen that even within the package at the time, there's a lot for greener energy, for renewable energy. A lot has been done. A lot is being done. The signals out there, you could argue, of course, we need to move faster. Of course, we're late. We know we are late for climate, from a science standpoint. But we are moving in the right directions. For a certain industry, for certain industrial sectors, things are quite different. So the pressure is not there. This is what I was touching upon during the presentation. The decades of free allocation has not put enough regulatory pressure on the industry to make the right investments, to invest in the wrong technologies. We know that there are technologies that allow to make the situation better, even for very hard to abate sectors. But they're not at scale. In most cases, they're not at scale yet, and we need to do something about it. And the incentives, you could argue, they are there. Of course, we have the innovation fund. The ETS revenues are exactly there for this purpose, to support companies decarbonize their production. We need to make sure these revenues are spent in such a way that is significant and that does not lock us in further fossil fuel technologies. We need to make sure we're very, very strict with how this money is spent. So it's important to spend in communities and for citizens, and to make sure that the technologies that we invest in are really carbon neutral, zero carbon.
Thank you, Lydia. Before I move to the next round of questions, I would like to remind the audience that we will have time to take questions from you. So there's a Q&A section on Zoom where you can put your questions, and as they come, we will see and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible in the timing that we have. Now, getting back to the existing policy framework and a bit of the novelties that the Fit for 55 revision brings. One of them is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, with which you, Mr. Chahim, worked quite extensively on that. How much of a game changer do you think that it's going to be for the decarbonization of heavy industries, especially now that it really seems to get moving? We're already in the transitional phase and in the first reporting phase. So What do you think of that, and what are you hearing from industry as well so far about that?
I do believe that it is a game changer, but everything is, I think, connected to what extent the revision also stands post 2030. Because I think that's very important. What will happen in the upcoming years is that, you know, the green transition plan or decarbonization plan of companies need to be presented, need to be finalized. I mean, if you are a company in the EU and you have by 2030 no idea how to decarbonize, then you either you don't want to be in the EU in the future, or you have no idea. I mean, if you have no idea, you will also not have a future. So we need to help companies make sure that the decarbonization plans can be made possible. So we need to scale up a lot of, let's say, green technologies, green atoms, green energy in general. So I think it's very important. What you see with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and what you also see with the ETS revision, is by 2038, with the current linear reduction factor, there are no allowances anymore. There will only be historic allowances. So the title of your research, the aristocracy of the ETS, will actually really be based on, let's say, historic allowances, and hopefully we can also end that as soon as possible. Not because they have the allowances, but because those technologies will not be cost effective anymore. What you see at the same time with CBAM is that other countries are thinking about their own CBAM. There's the UK, there are other countries that are setting up their own ETS system. Turkey is thinking about it, Morocco, Brazil. I mean, there are many changes in the world. So carbon pricing is not something exclusively for the EU. China has it, others are thinking about it. I also think that CBAM will become a policy. If you are decarbonizing your economy, then a carbon border adjustment mechanism is the best way to make sure that unfair competition is tackled at the border. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to decarbonize, you cannot keep open the back door for, let's say, companies outside the EU to continue polluting on your market. So I really believe that everything is at place to significantly decarbonize not only our own economy, but doing this together with other economies. Another element that's very important is if you look at investments in decarbonization, if you look, for example, at the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but also some other initiatives, they are heavily creating new economies in those countries. I think the Innovation Fund by its own will not be sufficient enough to scale up, but also not maybe to create these technologies, but not to scale them up. So we also need to make sure that we have enough batteries, we have enough, let's say, green alternatives to help decarbonize the let's say, heavy industry. Those elements altogether make me, let's say, at the end, positive about that these plans are feasible. But the next 5 years will be very important.
Because following up on that, and also bringing back the question of revenues, CBAM is also meant to raise revenues, right? So is it possible that we can see also a positive impact in local communities and societies, as we've just seen with some of the human stories on this project? Where do you see these funds that are going to be raised starting from 2026 funneled into?
So my position is I prefer not to raise a single euro on CBAM, because that means that every country has their own emission trading system or they've decarbonized. Why? Because I think the total revenues that we will collect, especially when phasing in CBAM and phasing out free allowances, will not be that significant. We're talking about a couple of billions. That's not a significant amount to decarbonize, let's say, the European industry. It's not even enough to help other countries to clean up their economy. So we need other funds as well. But the signal is very important. The signal is straightforward. After 15 years of having our own ETS system and asking our producers to pay a price, the premium, whether it was the price signal was weakened by free allowances or not, from a starting moment, from a moment 2026, everyone that wants to sell their product in our, like, say, very important big consumer market needs to pay for the CO2 emissions. I think that's the strongest signal. And hopefully the reaction from many countries will be, we prefer to collect the revenues ourselves instead of giving the revenues to the EU. That I hope would be the signal. But the amounts, you know, we're talking about a couple of billion in total for the whole EU. If we look at the gross domestic product of just a single country, it's not that significant.
Thank you very much. I would like to then maybe bring back the question of not necessarily only civil society, but really involving people in the EU's emissions trading system and our decisions around carbon pricing. And what you've mentioned about the next years and the next decade and how important this is going to be. And Sarah, we're already starting discussions at European level on, what should our objectives towards 2040 be? How do we need to strengthen our policies? But we also have a very important and crucial context at the moment, which is the upcoming EU elections and many important national elections across Europe. How do you think this is going to have an impact? First of all, actually, what do you think our priorities at EU level should be also ahead of the discussions around the next decade, and how do we bring people on board? Because it seems quite complicated to bring a lot of our population on board with the need for strengthened carbon pricing. What do you think?
Well, it's strange because at this higher political level, people are discussing my future, basically, in very difficult wordings and with a lot of buzzwords that sound really good and with complicated theories around them. But one way to make it more accessible is to, first of all, open the conversation towards the people that are actually impacted by the effect of the ETS. Because one of the things that has struck me most, I think, in researching this and hearing from you guys as well, is hearing numbers, hearing that the market has put a certain price on CO2 emissions, which basically means that we are putting a price on my future and other young people's future. And that's a conversation that is not being had, and that's a conversation that is super crucial because who decides that price? And why are young people that are actually impacted by that maybe not at the table when those prices are decided upon? It's a really big topic that especially the people that are going to be most affected by it are not necessarily included, or it's not accessible for them to understand it in the first place. And I feel like when something feels far away, or when something feels like the higher power is maybe deciding for you, that's when people push away. And I feel like that's exactly the last thing that Europe needs right now, especially talking from the perspective of young people that feel extremely underrepresented in climate policy.
Before I ask other panelists then their takes on the priorities for 2040, I think Sarah raised a very important topic. So I don't know if any of you would like to also answer from based also on her concerns as a young citizen who doesn't feel that her voice or like our collective is represented in these discussions.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. I was at the COP this year, and I talked to some young activists from all over the EU. And for example, I know that the Dutch government has talks with representatives to also include them in, let's say, the goals that the Dutch government has for certain targets. We don't have something similar like that on the European level. I would think that could be a very simple way to at least have these young voices at the table. I mean, it's a bit more complicated to see to what extent they can also have, let's say, from a legal point of view, a position. But I think as an advisory board or something, I think if I was part of the European Commission, this was something I would try to at least include and also have them included in the, let's say, the goal setting, but also as a they could also advise us on some legislations. I think that would be a very interesting, let's say, board to set up to really listen and to include them in the process of making and updating legislation. So I think you have a point. Yeah, but at the same time, you know, when it comes to climate justice, it's about intergenerational approach. So I also hope to have a very long life, but I will also hope that we limit damages as much as possible. We make sure that, you know, we take policies today that limit the effects of climate change. I mean, at some point, I hope that will be the result. But you have a clear point. You will be most probably higher affected by it than me. Yes, that's the point.
And that thing is something that I find important to stress, because you did speak on climate justice, and that's, I think, one of the questions that is staying with me after learning more about the EU ETS is that when we talk about this as a system to create justice. And of course, there's revenues from these emissions and these auctions, and they're being invested in great climate action. But when I speak to young people that are concerned about the climate crisis, they are concerned about injustice that goes beyond borders of the EU. And that is something that I'm curious about, whether that's even considered into policy, because the emissions that we emit here within the European Union, we can maybe invest some of those revenues in local decarbonization projects, but the people that are actually impacted by those emissions do not live in the EU. And I am more vulnerable as a youth, but I also understand that being a young person in the Netherlands, I'm still extremely privileged. And that's something that I have a lot of questions on. And I think it's also interesting that you said, which I think is really good to hear, that you want to involve more youth, especially when it comes to goal setting. And I think that's my next question, or something that will still go through my head throughout discussing this policy, is the goal that is being set is very unclear to me, because the goals that are being set in the setting of the European Union are usually about climate neutrality and net zero, and for someone that needs to live in that world, those promises are just not enough.
I would like to bring back Daniele Agostini. It would be great to hear also your reflections on that, and also on the future of our targets and priorities that should be pursued.
Sure. No, I think there's been a very basic failure in explaining this policy to the wider community. It's a policy that is true. It's got its complexities, for sure, but it is also extremely simple, because you were saying, clarity on the goal. The goal is completely clear. There's a cap, and the cap is going to zero, I think, by 2040. So in that sense, the clarity and the simplicity of this compared to other regulations is really astonishing in many ways. So I think in that sense, there needs to be a lot more outreach and working on communicating the strengths of this instrument. It is true that the carbon price is being set by market dynamics, just like any other market that you have. I mean, when you buy bread, when you buy cars, here you buy environment, and it is a lot more sensitive. But I think what people often is not explained is that the great thing about all of this is that the cap is there, and it's quite easy to see if the cap is going down. Now, is it going down fast enough? One could argue not. We think things are happening faster than anybody expects in terms of climate urgency, so we need to be ambitious. And so in that sense, but there should be more of a discussion on the cap and the target, and maybe I think the technicalities of the allocation. I always agree with Carbon Market Watch on the need to monitor and to make sure that it's done in a fair way. But for the young generations, I would and I explained emission trading to my children as well, I would emphasize that the basic beauty of this is that the cap is there, you can see it, and if you don't think it's low enough, then you should engage to make that cap lower, because that's the most important thing. How much is Europe emitting? And then the instrument will deliver that cap no matter what happens.
And it's true that the EU emissions trading system and carbon pricing has been quite successful in delivering decarbonization in the power sector. And this reminds me, when we had a bit of a conversation with the organizers behind the scenes, I was telling them that I've been reading this book called The New Climate War. And it's interesting because one of the points that it makes is when we see environmental activism and civil society, how it seems to be much easier to protest against pipelines than to demand stronger carbon pricing and making polluting companies pay for their revenue. So I would be very curious, Lydia, to also hear your thoughts on this reflection that we are just having in terms of the question of involving all citizens, but also on how we communicate and which narrative we should build or pursue around such an instrument.
Of course. Well, as a young person as well, who works in climate as well, I'm very touched by the point Sarah raised, indeed. And I will actually wanted to reply to one point you made about putting a price on our future, putting a price on carbon emissions, which means putting a price on our future, which is true. Point is, and also this reflection comes from the conversation that we constantly have with the stakeholders and with everyone really around carbon markets. And this is about the price of carbon. What about the carbon price? What if it raises? It has been raising. What if it raises too much? That's a feature of the system. That's not a flaw of the system. We need to make carbon pollution as inconvenient as it can possibly be, unless we want to ban CO2 altogether, which at the moment doesn't seem like an option. But we need to make it really as inconvenient as possible over time. And this is how we are trying to make this ranked. And this is one of the pillars, I think, where to base our narrative upon. Somebody needs to pay, and who needs to pay is the polluter. So we need to make sure that who has profited over decades and decades and decades over carbon pollution needs to chip in to reverse this process. And of course, to some extent, everyone will need to be involved. Every single citizen will need to be involved in this change. Everyone who lives in Western world economies, at least, has profited of these fossil fuel economies, and the way that we live is possible thanks to the fossil fuel economy. We need to reverse this process, every single one of us, but we need to make sure this process starts who really has accrued money and power over this. And this also links well to the points raised on third countries. We need to make carbon emissions are global, they're not limited to this. And also the point Mr. Shahim made on the revenues from CBAM. I do agree that at least at a certain point, they won't be huge. This, depending on how CBAM development goes, may change.
That's true, yeah.
Also how the carbon price develops, this may change, but it's very important as a signal. What is really important at the moment, especially discussing with emerging economies, is the perceived unjustness of this policy, and the sheer fact of saying, okay, this revenues will be given back, even for how little they are, this will still be important, and we need to make sure that the big polluters are targeted. This is, I think, very important in engaging with emerging economies of third countries and engaging with the citizens.
I don't think it's a hidden secret that everyone that worked on the file knows my position, that I prefer to label the full amount and give it back to let's say third countries or help decarbonize other economies. But there's a lot of technicalities in the parliament where that was made impossible. But we did say that for us it's very important to, increase and improve climate finance based also on the revenues we have with this instrument. That's very important for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything you want to maybe respond, Sarah? Any final reflections? Or? Right. Then perhaps as a next question, because if we talk from the point of view of the corporate sector, of heavy emitting industries, one of the main concerns at the moment is the question of competitiveness of the European economies. We're seeing a lot of discussion around Europe losing its competitive edge. We've been continuously seeing backlash on climate policies at national or European level as a result. And I mean, of course, if we lose this innovation, and if we lose this competitive edge, this will potentially also mean losing jobs, and which impacts on people at the end of the day. If we talk about human stories, how can we reconcile that? I mean, we are demanding, of course, companies to pay for their emissions and to enforce the polluter pays principle, which, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me as well. But can we, is the system fit at the moment to cope with enhancing innovation while also at the same time making sure that companies pay for their emissions and advance their decarbonization goals? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you want to go first?
Thanks for the easiest question of the panel. Tough one from my end. Again, I mostly use my time in convincing industries and policymakers and people that the industry needs to pay. But of course, the competitiveness one is a conversation to be had. We're waiting a report from Mr. Mario Draghi on this, which are very eagerly actually awaiting. And there's a lot. The Commission's views has been heavily focusing on this, especially in the past year. we need to make sure that the concept of carbon neutrality and sustainability is not ideologically opposed to that of competitiveness. The whole world is slowly but surely heading in that direction. Of course, the conversation that we have at COP may make it seem that it's going differently, but this is the direction where we're going to. Again, depends on the region, depends on the country, but this is where we're heading. If, as the European continent, the European Union, confidently take the lead in this transition, this once again an important signal to be had. To what extent is it possible, feasible for the European Union to actually take the lead, given the geopolitical condition, is another conversation to be had, but to be confident in these choices and to pursue them, I think may greatly help. We are a region that's extremely rich and important in carbon trade, and the choices that the European Union makes are bound to influence other continents' choices. So.
Maybe I'd like to bring back in first Daniele Agostini to also hear his thoughts on this question of competitiveness and environmental protection. Is the system really at the moment fit to reconcile both sides of the coin?
I think we're finally going in the right direction. It was one of the issues, this thing of competitiveness. I don't think it's ever, it was ever proved that there was an actual impact on competitiveness, a material impact. But there are other factors that may undermine the competitiveness of the European industry. Of course, for the power sector, this was less of an issue, except on some border member states. Like we have operations in Spain that compete with Moroccan power. So, of course, as we decarbonize Spanish power, you get leakage from Morocco. Same thing when you start going on the eastern border of some of the eastern member states, or also Greece with Turkey. But it was never proved. But I think, and thanks to the CBAM, and again, I want to congratulate, for the great job that you did. We started our conversation, and we're heading finally in the right direction by tackling this issue of competitiveness in a very open way, in direct way. And I think now the challenge is to make sure that the companies, industrial companies that want to decarbonize, have the incentives on one hand in terms of and the penalty and the price that they have to pay on the other. So the stick and the carrot to decarbonize. And those that don't want to decarbonize, they don't, they're not going to have too much of a future. So I think with CBAM, we're finally on the right track to completing the journey, and it's really going to take us in the right direction. One important thing, it has to be monitored very quickly, but very carefully, its effectiveness. And I completely agree on the fact that revenues should be used to support our trade partners to decarbonize on their side as well, rather than be used in Europe. And that was part of the end position on the revenues of CBAM should be used for that purpose.
Thank you.
I mean, if I may, I do think that the system, if you study the system and look at how we approach, let's say, every sector and benchmarks in the sector, I do believe that there is a negative, let's say, a delaying effect when it comes to stimulating innovation. Why? Because current technologies, current interests are the ones that you use to define benchmarks. And when you have a disruption, that disruption usually does not have a place. I can give you an example. Let's look at steel. We define benchmarks in steel based on, let's say, the production technology. If you produce steel through hydrogen, which is has a potential to be climate neutral, or at least low carbon, then within the sector, it doesn't have a position within the ETS sector. In a normal system, you would take that technology and redefine, let's say, the benchmark and hence the free allowances, but that's not part of it. So I would say that the system sometimes is not incentivizing technology, not incentivizing innovation. In others, let's say cement. In cement, you get CO2 based on your historic emissions, free allowances, and there you can see that the percentage of clinker in that product also defines how much CO2 you emit. And actually, if you become cleaner, you can lose free allowances. So the system does not always help let's say, incentivize decarbonization. In my opinion, in the new revision, we try to solve some of these and tackle some of these issues. But at the end, what we need in the coming years is when there's a disruption, when there's a new technology that really, let's say, sets a new standard in a sector, we should try to accelerate the inclusion of that technology instead of only look at historic emissions and historic allowances. And for example, there are a lot of historic allowances in the market that are not used now. Who has them? What can they do with them? What is there's no time, and there's no end date on those allowances. This is something that really worries me a bit, because we do not know when they will enter the market, at what price will they enter the market, will they disrupt the market or not. I mean, these are elements that still could delay, let's say, decarbonization within the ETS system, but probably this is an issue we should tackle in the next revision, but I really believe it is necessary.
Thank you. How does this discussion resonate with you as well, Sarah?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think when we talk about carbon leakage, I'm no economist, so I'm definitely here to learn, but what I hear as well is that there's a lot of fear of carbon leakage, and if I learn anything from your presentation, it's that I think because of that fear, we've also allowed a lot of emissions to happen as like a dark cloud of a threat hanging over us. Like, we cannot be stricter on these huge polluters or else they will leave. And in that sense, we give that industry a lot of power over policy by also still believing in that and by confirming that over and over again. And that's something that I put my question marks with. And then the other thing that I'm wondering is that obviously I understand when we talk about innovation that having the cap and trade system means that that a company can be incentivized to decarbonize so that they can sell some of those allocated emissions. But under the cap system, doesn't that always mean that those emissions that are then saved by a company having the initiative to being less pollutive will actually automatically go to another company?
Could go, that's exactly.
Do we ever reach somewhere under the cap, or do we always fill this cap? Because this cap is still very high.
So that's exactly the point that I tried to make, that a lot of these emissions and a lot of these allowances that basically companies could historically save and build up, they don't have an end date. There's no due date for these allowances. I mean, that could create an issue within the system. You have a valid point there. What we hope is that innovation at that point is in such a way that it doesn't make any sense to sell them or there's no market for them. That's what we hope. But I mean, this is an issue. So theoretically, when you become one of the best performers in your sector, you get, let's say, full compensated for your CO2 emissions. And when you improve, you can even use those emissions that you could let go in the market or sell them in the market. But that doesn't mean, indeed, that the cap is theoretically a cap that you can always reach year after year. Well, the cap gets adjusted each year, but that amount could be, but that's included in the system.
True. I just think I would believe more in a system where individual companies do get an individual cap and they are incentivized financially to personally decarbonize from that company, but then whatever they save doesn't go to someone else, that we can really radically reduce the cap over time.
Just one
quick comment from
very
Lydia.
short point. We would, as an organization, we would have liked the Industrial Emission Directive to tackle that to some extent, to put CO2 limits to individual installation. But policy-making bodies haven't really agreed on that. It's a tough battle in the parliament. But there will be policy solution to make that happen.
Good.
Thank you. Then we still have a few minutes to go in this discussion, so I would like to bring perhaps a couple of questions from the audience. There is a first question related around citizen involvement, and I'm thinking that maybe Sarah Nasraoui and Mohammed Shahim can give us some thoughts on that. which is, has the EU considered an EU Citizens' Assembly? I mean, it's not that you can answer this question by itself, because you're not Commission representatives, but they say some European countries have used this well for including representative voices on complex climate legislation. So perhaps maybe rephrase it in a way that how useful could it be to have an EU Citizens' Assembly on climate, but not only? We've seen a few examples, the French case, for instance, in which some conclusions made it into actual legislation. What would you think of that?
It really depends how it's going to be operationalized. I feel like when it comes to participation, obviously setting up a panel of concerned citizens and a diverse group of people that are actually impacted by the EU ETS would be amazing if there's actually going to be effect of that, if that group of people is actually going to be listened to. So I think that's the most important thing that we have to remember, that participation is not it's not a thing we can check off the list. It's something we have to take very seriously. So when we do that in the European context, I would be very much for that, but only and only if it actually means that the people are not just advising policy, but actually get a say.
Thank you.
My answer would be twofold. First of all, I'm an elected, democratic elected member, and I hope I represent citizens. That's something I try to do every week when I'm here in Brussels or Strasbourg, and also when I get back. I have a very low, you can approach me very easily, and I try to talk to many people. So we also should not, substitute the one with the other. I think they could, it's always good to have elected officials, and then they should really, in a serious way, interact with citizens. We had that here in the EU with the Conference on the Future of Europe. It was, I think there were some successes there. There was quite some participation, but it's very complicated because the distance between, let's say, all 450 million Europeans to politicians that are in Brussels or in Strasbourg, there is also, there is a distance, not only mentally, but also, real distance. People do not have just time to travel here. And what we saw at the future of the Conference of the Future of Europe is that, let's say you have a job and you are asked to participate to go to Strasbourg for 3 or 4 days in a week. At some point, I think it's also fair to compensate them because they are doing things that, because else you make it very privileged and only for those who could spare the time and come and interact. But at the same time, you should also be honest on promises, what they will put on the table, to what extent will you include it. It should not be just, participation, we've done it, next phase or next step. That makes it a bit complicated also with you have elections, you elect people, then you have participation and consultations, and I have no answer there. But I do believe that these type of conferences on a youth level, in a general level, should be created and organized more often.
Definitely, that it's not simply a PR exercise around how democratic and
the more you do it, the more people interact with the EU. Sometimes the EU is abstract. In some countries, the EU is used as an excuse. Sometimes you can say that things are forced upon us by the EU. Sometimes you can say it's not allowed by the EU. The EU is not something abstract. We are the EU. All of us, politicians, citizens, and we need to make that much more visible for people.
Definitely. And then perhaps one last question this time, addressed to Daniele Agostini on the question of around industrial emission reductions. The question says, how do we assume that we overcome the problem of competitiveness, as most industries don't have access to alternative fuels, for example, biofuels? What can you tell us about that?
Abatement reductions that can be done without moving into the hard-to-abate technologies, where we will need hydrogen. So hydrogen will be needed as we approach zero, so 2035 onwards. So we still have more than 10 years of emission reductions that can happen. And so in that sense, I believe that we can move on those abatement opportunities, emission reduction opportunities, as we do more research and innovation on the ones where we're still struggling, like hydrogen and CCS, which still need a bit of work to make them efficient.
Thank you very much. And then just to wrap up, one last question. I would like to maybe have a sentence from each one of you on, now that we are going to the next election cycle, and we're going to have a new European Commission, a new parliament and institutions, and we'll be starting to discuss this 2040 targets. We've already started, actually. What do you think then should be the number one priority in the next years in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of strengthening it and strengthening our climate policies? Maybe some final thoughts from each one of you.
Well, if I speak from my position, it's strange to me sometimes, and especially with the elections coming up, that I am a youth representative, and I feel like with the elections coming up, everyone should realize that, just as you said, we are all the EU, all politicians, all citizens, everyone involved, and it shouldn't be like that I am a youth representative. I feel like we all should be. We should all take that responsibility on our sides, because if you represent people, you represent the youth of that people. And I feel like that's something we have to remember through every step of every way. When we set goals, we think about who is going to live with that goal. If we put a price on that, if we discuss who is going to be involved, I want everyone to remember that everyone is a youth representative.
Thank you.
For me, the next election, the elections will be, I think we have to continue the path that we've set with the Fit for 55 to continuously decarbonize. Why? Because I believe the discussion is not how long can we preserve industry that exists today. I think how fast can we create the industry that will continue existing tomorrow. It's about decarbonizing our heavy industry, creating conditions that we do not depend on fossil fuels coming from outside the EU. Create sustainable jobs, competitive jobs, and clean jobs. And for me, the faster we do that, the stronger our competitiveness will be compared to other regions in the world. If we continue subsidizing industries that have no future without those subsidies, you're basically throwing away money. Yes, changing the economy will cost a lot of money, but we are there to help them with the right subsidies, the right incentives, but they also have to step up and investing their capital in clean technology, scaling them up. That's the way they stay in the EU. That's the way we create new jobs together. That would be, I think, a very important topic for me.
Thank you. Livia?
Well, for me, in the view of the next election, just to make sure we highlight the benefits of climate policy to all citizens. We're already seeing some degree of backlash, backlash to climate policy, and we cannot allow this to happen further. And we need to make sure the citizens do not feel targeted by climate policies. And I think one of the best ways to do this is to make sure we apply the polluters pay principle fully, and that we're vocal about applying it.
Thanks, Olivia. And then last but not least, Daniele Agostini.
But I would connect to what Lydia was saying. I think it's important in my eyes that we don't call them anymore only climate policies. This is about a system shift that is going to deliver benefits not only in terms of climate, but in terms of air quality, in terms of energy independence of Europe. We've seen with the Ukraine crisis how exposed we are from a fossil fuel dependence, and it's going to be even more as unfortunately the situation in the Middle East seems to get worse. So it's really about more talking about a system shift, maybe an energy transition that has repercussions not only in terms of benefits of climate, but in terms of air quality, energy independence. I would say circular economy is going to make us more efficient. So it's really important. And as it was being said, it's about the future of European industry. So it's also a question of jobs. Energy transition is there to give us an opportunity to invent the new jobs of the future. So it would be really important that it's not just considered the realm of environmentalists, but also something that everybody should be pushing for, not only for climate, but for many other good reasons. And unfortunately, I think that doesn't seem to be enough the case. And we only remember that the energy transition is important for energy independence when we have time of crisis. But now that things are getting a bit more easy, then we go back to the old habits. So again, it's not only about climate, but it's also about other things. I would also like to close by saying, I resonate when we say we put a price on the future. And I think it's true. What worries me is that we don't talk about those policies that do not put that price. There are a lot of policies out there in the environmental field as well that are not ambitious enough. And maybe they would be ambitious if we realized that the price was too low that they were putting on the environment. Thinking of local air quality, Europe has very polluted urban centers. Nobody talks about the cost and the price that is being paid. The price is very low and the cost is very high for our health. So again, the system is not perfect or carbon pricing, but at least it does raise a debate over whether we value enough our future and our environment.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm afraid that this is all the time that we have for today's discussion. It's been really an insightful discussion on everything around, ranging from industrial competitiveness to making our carbon pricing systems fit for purpose, on bringing citizens and people on board. We had a great discussion today, so I would like to thank you very much to Lide Tamelini, to Mohamed Shahim, to Sara Nasrawi, and also to Daniele Agostini for having joined us in today's discussion. From my side, everything that is left to say is that you can still follow us and keep up of what's going on with the Life Extra project at the website etextra.org, etextra.org, to also get to know the Human Stories project, which we discussed earlier with Noemi, to thank once again the LIFE program for its support on this project. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the 5th event on the Carbon Pricing Hub series. There's going to be a 6th event coming up soon. So also by checking our website and following us in our channels, you can stay tuned on when the next one is going to be. Thank you very much once again to our panelists, to all of you who have joined us for your participation, and see you next time. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye to everybody.